That's what I put down on in the sign-in. Favorite playground memory, playing kick the can on the alley behind Princeton. So thank you, Helen, for that lovely introduction, and it's a pleasure to be back in Butte, my hometown, for the Henri Raw. This is my third time speaking at the Henri Raw, and I always love to, well, be here in Butte for any reason, but especially for the festival. And I'm also pleased to be here at the Butte Archives. I spent a lot of my life in it. Well, the building didn't exactly look like this during a lot of my research. I began my research when it really was still the old fire hall. And they still had the pole with the hole, you know, down the middle, we're surrounded by old books and newspapers and all, but it is a tremendous resource, the archives. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my books. I am the author of 3 books. The first one is One Night in a Bad Inn. The second is Finding the Bad Inn, Discovering My Family's Hidden Past. And the third is East of the East Side. The books are all historical nonfiction. They read like novels, but they're all true. Now, my heritage in Butte is actually pretty common. What we have here is Irish, actually Irish and Welsh, not so many Welsh in Butte, but a lot of Irish, and Slavic, Slovenian. Irish and Slavic. I was surprised. I sold books one time at the East Butte. It was East Butte reunion, and only One Night in a Bad Inn had come out at that time, and everybody wanted to buy it because they were all part Irish and part Slavic, because the two communities intermarried. And actually, a friend of mine, Mary Beth, who Eddie knows from, I know her from St. Anne's, you know her from Central, right? She told me she felt really left out growing up in Butte. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, I wasn't Irish and I wasn't Slavic. I said, what were you? She said, I was French. But it wasn't just Irish and, of course, Irish and Slavic in Butte. A priest told my Auntie Isla that he grew up in Meterville. Now, all of you from Butte know that Meterville was, it's gone now because of the pit, but it was the Italian area. So he said, I grew up in Meterville, and I thought the whole world was Italian. And then I went to Boys Central, run by the Irish Christian Brothers, and there he learned that the whole world is Irish. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the 3 books. And Helen alluded a little bit to how I got started in all this. I was a mechanical engineer with Bechtel, and I came here to Butte in 1997 when my Aunt Helen Leskovar passed away. Some people have asked about the car dealership, now the Honda dealership. It was my grandfather who started and with Willie's back before the war, and then my uncle and my dad, Ted, had Lincoln Mercury. And anyway, so my Aunt Helen Leskovar, Joe's wife, passed away in 1997. I came here for the funeral, and everybody knows what happens at a Butte funeral, right? Family gets together, you have the funeral, then you go up to the house, and then story, right? So I'm hearing all these stories, and then we went out to Whitehall to see my aunt, who on the other side of the family, who was too ill to come into town that day. And we're sitting there in Whitehall, the beautiful view of the tobacco roots in her picture window, and she brings out this box. And she takes these papers out of the box. Of course, everybody's talking the whole time, right? And this piece of paper goes from person to person, and it lands in my lap. And it's a rap sheet from Deer Lodge, from the prison. And with a picture of a very handsome young man, very handsome mugshot, I would say. And I said to my mom, who is this? And she said, it's Grandma's brother, your Uncle Archie. Well, I didn't know my grandmother had brothers. And so then one of my aunts started talking about this fire on the ranch out by Forsyth in eastern Montana, and there was a dead body found, determined to be Arthur, my great-grandfather, tall man in the back of One Night in a Bad Inn. And then he was arrested, then his wife was arrested for murdering him. So, well, this was kind of stunning in all these years. I'd never heard any of this. And then one of my aunts mentioned, she said, well, I was a grown woman before I knew my mother lived in an orphanage. And we're all like, orphanage? You know, and nobody connected those two stories, which is, in retrospect, is kind of funny that we didn't make that connection. So I went back to my job in Las Vegas, and just one day this idea popped into my head that I was gonna go find out what happened and write a book about it. And what didn't occur to me until after I'd actually written the book was that I decided to write a book before I even knew what happened. How did I know it was gonna be, you know, all that interesting? So I went all over the world to find the story. And that, I felt like I was living in a book with this whole experience. And so I started writing down my experiences. Because I went to Wales, I went to Ireland, and went to the battlefields of World War I. As you can see, this is a World War I soldier here, my grandfather, in the American Army. So that's finding the bad end. So I decided to write that and make that another book. I didn't, from the outset intend to do that. But when I started writing the book, One Night in a Bad Inn, my first intention was I was going to write about all 4 grandparents, and there was just way too much story for one book. So that's why there are 3. So East of the East Side, which is my newest book, is about the Slovenian part of the family. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of focus mostly on the Irish side, but I do want to touch a little bit on the Slavic side, just because I know a lot of people will be looking at both. And I did find a lot of helpful material that would have been helpful One Night in a Bad Inn. But anyway, just to tell you a little bit about this story before I move on to sources. This handsome man, Tony Leskovar, he was a peasant boy living in Austria at the turn of the century, 1900, in an area that is now Slovenia. This was before World War I, so it was Austria-Hungary. And he loves music. Someone gives him a harmonica, and he just loves music. And so he goes off by himself to the big city, Ljubljana, which is the principal city of that area and now the capital of Slovenia. And he enrolls in the conservatory, the music conservatory. He becomes a concert bassoonist. And he is, in 1914, he is performing across Europe for kings and queens, and then he lands in Paris. And he is performing with the opera in Paris. And he is on top of the world. He is, you know, Paris is a center of arts in 1914, and he's making good money, you know, sipping cognac at the Café de la Paix, you know, near the Opera House. And
can I ask, I know you said harmonica, did he learn any other?
The bassoon.
Bassoon. Okay.
Somebody must have given him a harmonica as a child, and then he learned the bassoon, which is a woodwind, you know, very difficult instrument. And he liked that deep tone of the woodwinds. So he is performing in 1914, and then what happens? The Archduke is shot. A month later, Europe goes to war. Well, you know, it's funny. You know, we know what a bad war World War I was in retrospect, but at the time there were people who said it's going to be over in a few weeks, no big deal. You know, these European wars, 6 weeks and they're done. But there were other people who were saying, no, this time it's going to be different. It's going to be a lot worse. Well, Tony, you know, he's kind of stuck. Because if you did not get on a train immediately, I mean that day that mobilization happened, you were stuck, because the entire country of France went on a war footing in 15 days. So that meant no civilian train travel. Everything was for the military. So he couldn't have even gotten home if he wanted to. So he stayed, and he, you know, it was tough because, you know, everything was for the war, musicians weren't being paid. He told my dad that he would smoke cigarettes to quell his appetite because he didn't have money for food. See, that was the other thing that happened. When World War I started, like I said, all these people were stuck. Well, a lot of them were Americans in Paris who were tourists. And so they're all, we want to get on a ship, pay our hotel bill, get on a ship, get out of Europe, go home. So what do? There's no ATM and no credit cards, right? So people would go to the bank to get money. No money. They would, the French government would not let any money leave the country. So these Americans, like, we got to pay our hotel bill. We can't get any money. So they all start flooding the embassy. And actually, I learned all that because of a first-hand account by the ambassador, the American ambassador. That was an incredible find to find his story. So what ended up happening was President Wilson sent literally a ship full of gold to Europe to essentially pay the bills of these Americans, because otherwise they couldn't leave. There was I tell the story of an Austrian painter who was in Paris when the Archduke was shot. And he's at a party, you know, in a very fashionable part of Paris, and he's sitting next to this Austrian count, and they're all saying, oh, the Archduke was shot. He's the heir to the Austrian throne. And the painter says, well, what happens now? And the count says, why should anything happen? You know, a lot of royals had been killed, you know, the Empress Elizabeth had been assassinated, you know, President McKinley had been assassinated, you know, it wasn't, not to make little of it, but it wasn't, some people saw it as earth-shattering, some people didn't. So the painter goes off to paint the White Cliffs of Dover, which he did every summer. And then everybody goes to war, and he's stuck. And so what happened in a lot of countries were anybody who was from one of the warring countries was interned, concentration camps. And the painter, he said, what the worst part of it was that you never had any time by yourself, no moment of quiet. And he said it drove some people crazy. I mean, literally, they went crazy. And they called it the barbed wire disease. So Tony managed to skirt that. My grandfather, he was passing himself off as Serbian, and you know, Serbia and France were allies in the First World War. And what French policeman can tell the difference between a Slovenian accent and a Serbian accent? But then after a while, it became untenable, and he did flee here, and then he ends up in East Helena, and then in Butte. So that gives you a little idea of my 3 books. So now I want to pivot onto, okay, maybe you want to go find your stories, and maybe you want to have a little guidance on genealogy. So my first thing I want to say is a word of caution. If you are under the illusion that all your ancestors were perfect, stop now, because I can guarantee they weren't, especially if they lived in Butte. So just to tell you a little bit about how I started my research. Again, I started with One Night in a Bad Inn, and I knew about this fire on the ranch and the dead body and all that, so I called the courthouse in Forsyth, which is Rosebud County, and I asked, do you have any record of Sarah Hughes, my great-grandmother, being arrested for murder? Off the clerk of court goes, she comes back. No. You know, I left my job, my engineering job, but was it I told the wrong story, or what happened here? So I said, okay, thank you. And then I called back, and this is the lesson here. I asked, do you have any record of Sarah Hughes being arrested for anything? And she said yes, and it turns out, just to tell you, I don't want to give a spoiler, there was another husband in there. So she was arrested for murder, but she had a different last name, which I didn't know about yet. So the lesson there is you ask open-ended questions. You don't ask, was she arrested for X? You ask, was she arrested for anything? And that's a good lesson for all of your genealogical research and when you're talking to family members. You ask an open-ended, especially it depends on the personality of the person. Some people, they'll give you a direct answer to a direct question, but you really don't want that, do you? You want them to start talking. So one thing I did, as far as once I started doing all this research, I kept a timeline, and I found this to be very convenient. And one way to keep track of things, and another way to try to corroborate information. So I kept a timeline of the date, of course, events in family history, and then events in world and local history. And give you an example of where that really was handy. My grandfather's family, my grandfather Peter Thompson, he came to Butte in 1914. His uncle, John Gribben, who is Mike's grandfather, Mike Gribben's in back there, my cousin Mike. Half of the family, of my grandfather Peter's siblings stayed in Ireland, Northern Ireland, Belfast. First Randallstown, then Belfast. So when I was doing my research, I still had a a great aunt who was 88 in Ireland to go talk to, which was wonderful. And she told me that her father, when he came on the Arabic, that's the name of the ship, and when the ship went back, it was sunk by a German U-boat. Well, that's very dramatic, but I wanted to confirm everything I could, and so that was easy enough. So I put that in the timeline, right? Because I had his ship arrival information, so I knew when he arrived. So I knew when the ship went back, and so I researched that, and that was pretty easy to find when the Arabic sank. So you put that in your timeline, and then things pop out at you. You realize, oh yeah, she was right. And then that also, another thing that helps with, then you start to realize Aunt Bridget is a reliable source. Because there are some people, I know you know people like this, who tend to exaggerate, they might, embellish. Like on my dad's side, one of my cousins, well, several cousins, and I think they all heard it from one person, and I think I know who that person was, that my great uncle Ray Ryan, another Irishman, was a spy during World War II. And I thought, he was in San Francisco. I don't think he was a spy. And I knew he was in San Francisco all the time, but actually, I could actually find those records. They're now, the National Archives are online. It wasn't called the CIA then, it was called, what was it, OSS? I forget what that stands for right now. It's eluding me right now, but it was a precursor to the CIA.
So he was a spy.
And so he was a spy. No, he didn't work there.
Right.
Yeah, I found out that he did not work there.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that he wasn't. And it was just, so then then you start to realize, okay, I see some exaggeration. I think it was somebody was pulling someone's leg, and it got repeated, and then like the telephone game, and then people believed it. And like I said, I know who the source was, and he was a guy who would like to, pull your
Joke
leg.
around.
Yeah, so. Okay, so that, before I go on to talking about people, I don't want to forget about this. One thing I did discover when I was doing this Slovenian research, which did not come up, because I think I didn't know to ask about it. You're all familiar with the census, the US Census, right? Well, the Catholic Church did its own census every year. It's called the Status Animarum. And I have a handout here, which you're all welcome to take. And I have it written down on here. And what Status Animarum means is state of the souls. And so the priests every year would essentially do a census of the whole parish. Now, I don't know how it's done really in modern times, but the ones that I found in Slovenia, I learned about this from the Slovenian genealogy folks, but I gotta believe they're also with the church records in Ireland also. I just didn't know about them to ask for them.
So,
Yeah.
I'm not seeing that status armada on this handout.
It's under churches.
Churches?
It says baptismal marriage.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
there, thank
Oh,
you.
status,
Thank you.
okay, there it
Yeah,
is.
status
Okay,
on
got it.
arm, yeah. And, these things, it's always gonna depend on who is taking the notes as to how copious those notes are. But with the Slovenian ones, I found a lot of very interesting tidbits in there. So when you are looking at church records, I would ask for that also.
Okay.
And, here, of course, it's gonna be the Diocese of Helena. So, as far as your sources.
So real quick, it's in the Diocese of Helena?
Helena, if
So
it's
all the Catholic Church would send their stuff?
The status
to
on them are,
Helena?
I'm pretty sure. Now,
Montana's.
Well, no, Butte,
State.
Butte, this is just part of the state. There's the Diocese of Billings, the Diocese of Helena.
So where would Anaconda fall in?
Helena.
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 Okay.
Diocese of Helena. But I should take that back. You might try the parish. This
No,
is the whole thing.
go to Helena.
Yeah.
The parish will tell you we won't release them. You have to have a note. Basically, you need a note from the principal to access any of the records in
okay.
Helena.
Well, and to access in Helena, you have to fill out a form, and
It's very difficult.
it is. And they ask basically for a donation, and then they don't get the information
Oh, really?
correct back to you either.
Oh, see, when I was doing this, it was Sister Dolores was the archivist.
Yeah, and she
And
has
she was
retired.
fantastic.
Yeah.
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 So
Yeah, whoever's there now is not.
Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, because I think before Sister Dolores, I had tried to get records and had a hard time. But you might try the parish, too.
Well,
First.
see, mine is trying to figure out what, they were in an orphanage in Helena, So there were 3 different ones.
Okay,
One is
that's,
a convent, one, and they were all associated with the diocese, so trying to find out which one is.
okay, I think one of them was, I think it was run by Sisters of the Good Shepherd. I mentioned that
That's,
in
that's
my
one of
notes.
them, yes.
The religious order might have those records. Because I did find, okay, in east of the east side, some of my relatives who married into the family were Indians, you know, up there at Flathead, Kootenai.
Oh, okay.
And one of them, I can't remember right now. Anyway, was it the Ursulines? Anyway, I got the records I needed from them, from the Ursulines. So you might try the religious order. They were very helpful.
That's
They had
good.
an archivist who was very, immediately, she sent me the information through email.
Sister Frances used to be at the Ursuline. She has a lot of information too.
Yeah, but the sisters, this one is Sisters of the Good Shepherd.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Ursulines, this was, like I said, up at Flathead.
And then there was St. Joseph's, and there were 3 different ones in Helena,
Yeah.
all run by the diocese, but,
Yeah, in my case with One Night in Nevada, my grandmother was in the orphanage in Twin Bridges.
okay.
So those records are at
Are
the Montana
public,
Historical.
aren't they?
Now, you have to get like a family member to release it because they're underage, which was not a big deal. But it's Montana Historical Society has that.
Which
Okay.
is closed until 2025.
Oh, gosh,
Oh.
yeah.
So,
They're-
they might respond to email requests, I don't know what that status
They
is.
said they would.
So, yeah.
So anyway, as far as sources, my big piece of advice is go broad, do a broad sweep. Now, my relatives in One Night in Nevada got into a lot of legal troubles, and so I just decided I am going to just go through, park myself at the Silver Bow County Courthouse, and I'm going to look for anything all these years with their name on it, right? So what did I find? Well, a lot. But one of the big things that I found was that my great-grandmother, Sarah Hughes, was in a lawsuit. She had a boarding house at 415 Kemper, which was later the Jefferson School. It's all gone now. It was a part of the area that was cleared out in anticipation of the pit. She got into a lawsuit with, with Mrs. Doherty. But did Mrs. Doherty buy the boarding house? I guess she owned it and Sarah was renting it, that was right. Well, the court documents have a detailed description of everything in the boarding house. I mean, it's just a fantastic time capsule. So the reason I'm bringing that up is you just never know. You know, this kind of information can pop up anywhere. And also, just because you go looking for something and you don't find it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I have a birth certificate. Come on in. I have a birth certificate. Hi, Mariel. Hi. I have a birth certificate for my Aunt Patsy Hughes, who was born in Forsyth, or else on the ranch outside of Forsyth. The Rosebud County Courthouse does not have that. Got lost, who knows? So just remember, just because you can't find it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, doesn't mean it isn't true. One other thing I want to touch on, important point here, is Ellis Island. Okay, ship arrival records. I want to just explain how this works, because there's a lot of misconceptions about Ellis Island. There's a website, and it's on here, ellisislandrecords.org. What ellisislandrecords.org is a list of everybody who came through New York after Ellis Island opened. Doesn't mean they went through Ellis Island. My grandfather, Peter Thompson, his Uncle John Gribben sent him enough money for a ticket to come second class. But his records are there because it's everybody who came through New York. Only people in steerage went through Ellis Island. And the other thing is, you gotta remember, that's one port. It's just New York. So if they came through Philadelphia, if they're really early on, came through Charleston, my great-grandfather Arthur, on the back here, he came through Quebec and then came down to the United States. So the other thing is, this is how it works. Okay, you're in line, let's say you're Tony Leskovar, right? And it's 1915, and you have been in Paris for several months, you've run out of food, you're finally trying to evade the French police, and you are on your way to the United States. So he's in Bordeaux to get on his ship. Passengers are in line, the ship's doctor is taking down their names. Okay, what's your name? Here, actually, I will read that part, it's in here. Better for you to hear it from here. Okay, so, since this is a French ship leaving from a French port, the doctor is French. Tony speaks enough French to understand the questions. How old are you, the doctor asks. 27, says Tony. Are you married? No. Can you read? Yes. Can you write? Yes. What is your occupation? Musician. I play the bassoon. He looks Tony over. He writes, gray eyes, hair chestnut, 5 feet 8 inches tall. He was more like 5 feet 11. You gotta remember, people were not into precision like we are now. So I don't know, whatever, 5'8", whatever, you know. What was your permanent last address? Paris. What is the address of your nearest relative in France? I have no family in France. What is your nationality? Serbian. How much money do you have? 150 francs. That was around $30. He didn't have 130, oh yeah, he did, getting on the ship, that's right. You had to have a certain amount of money to get on the ship, right? So, what does that tell you? All that information that's on that ship arrival record was written in France. It was not written at Ellis Island. Nobody changed anybody's name at Ellis Island. Nobody wrote down anybody's name at Ellis Island. The French doctor wrote Antoine Leskovar with an ER. The problem with the ellisislandrecords.org is it's not Google. It's not a great search engine. So you just kind of had to look out, because I'm looking for Antoine Leskovar with an AR. It was Antoine, which is the French spelling of Antoine. And maybe Tony said Antoine, you know, because he's speaking French.
Right.
And maybe he said his name. You know, when I studied in France, you know, I would say my name with a French accent. It just made it easier for people to understand. So all I mean is, nobody changed anybody's name at Ellis Island, because then what happened when they got to Ellis Island, and just to tell you a little bit of the in-between story, so you had to have a certain amount of money to get in the country, right? So Tony thinks he'll improve his $130 on the ship. Doing what? Gambling. How well do you think that worked out? Not very well. He ends up with $1.
Oh.
5 francs. 5 francs. So that's equivalent of $1. So he's in line. They're at Ellis, you know, they're the whole mass of people, because he was in steerage, you know, mass of people going up the steps, and, you know, these doctors would give him like a 60-second, oh yeah, you don't look like you're about to die, okay, you can come in the country. That was the medical exam.
Yeah.
So he's in line with this tailor from Russia, and because the Slavic languages are close enough that they can understand each other. So the tailor tells him, yeah, you have to have, I can't remember what the amount was at that time, I think it was $40, I can't remember, $30, $40 to get in, and he didn't. And you had to buy a round trip ticket, so that if they kicked you out at New York, you had the ticket to go back. So, so the tailor said twice he was sent back, but now he had $200, so he was good. So Tony's like, okay, great, you know, I have $1. And so Tony's got his bassoon in his one hand and his suitcase in the other, and he walks up there, and for the tailor's in front of him, and so the Jewish tailor goes up, and the immigration officer at Ellis Island says, how much money you got? $200. Show me. Go anyway. There's Tony. I'm sure he's I don't know if he was sweating bullets or he's just cool as a cucumber, because I remember my grandfather being cool as a cucumber, but I didn't know when he was 28. So he goes up there, and the immigration officer says, how much money do you have? And he says, I remember he said $30, $40. Okay, he just sent him in.
Wow.
He didn't ask it. Welcome to America. One other thing about names, the spelling of names. Now, there's this misconception that people had their names changed at Ellis Island. They did not. There's also, I think, a misconception that there is one way to spell Irish names. And we all know that's not true. I had some people contact me, and they were looking up Doherty. And I said, you know, there are lots of ways to spell Doherty. It could be D-A-U, could be D-O-U, could be T-R-Y, could be T-R-E-Y. One thing you have to remember is a lot of our family came like end of the 19th century. A lot of them were illiterate. Well, that's one thing you find out. If you get the birth certificate, like both of my great-grandmother Jane Gribben, and my great-great-grandmother Jane Gribben, and my Welsh great-grandmother were both illiterate. How do I know that? When I got the birth certificate from Britain, which one of my cousins in Ireland handled all that for me, it showed she marked her X. She did not sign the birth certificate. So you gotta remember, Gaelic, as I'm sure all of you know, has a different alphabet. It doesn't have our alphabet. Plus you have people who are illiterate, the names, whatever. And so that's why even within a family, you are probably gonna see different spellings of surnames. Now, one handy book I did find, there is actually a book about, probably more than one, on Irish surnames. And so, like that told me that Gribben came from Donegal. I found that at the library in Las Vegas, if you can believe it. And so that can also help to narrow down. If you're not sure where they could be, what part of Ireland they came from, or you're reaching a dead end, you might consult that book. But it wasn't only last names that changed, or could be spelled differently. So, a little story from one night in the Bad Inn. So, the next spring, Rose, my great-grandmother, Mike's great-grandmother, now 40 years old, delivered another baby girl, whom they named Roseanne and called Rosie. The year after that, yet another daughter arrived, their 12th child. They named her Bridget, and they called her Bridget until she started school. Bridget, B-R-I-D-G-E-T, right? On her first day, while calling roll, the teacher exclaimed, "Bridget Thompson, what are you doing named for a Swedish saint? Don't you want to be Irish?" "Yes, Miss McNeil." "Then you will be Bridget, B-R-I-G-I-D. So from then on, that's how my great aunt became Bridget.
Wow.
So anyway, I tell these stories just to give you an idea that people's first names could be spelled differently, people's last names, and that can make things a little bit confusing. So I'm going to go ahead and close now. I'm going to read a little bit from the end of Finding the Bad Inn, and then I'm going to be here as long as anybody has questions or anything you want to ask about. So one thing I'm asked a lot about, One Night in the Bad Inn has a lot of true crime in it. And East of the East Side has not so much true crime, but my relatives were not saints, not even close. And so the idea of the book wasn't to air a bunch of family skeletons. It was to tell an important story. And my idea wasn't to hurt anybody. So I wanted to be very careful about how I did that, and also I did let all my family members who were alive who were in the book read it, and if there's anything they didn't want to be included, to tell me. So I'm going to read a little bit at the end of Finding the Bad Inn. You might say that's all well and good, but why do this? Why leave a perfectly good career and go traipsing across the globe, snooping around to discover what skeletons may be tucked away in the recesses of a vast family closet? Why not leave them lie? As Aunt Betsy said to her nephew, David Copperfield, it is in vain to recall the past unless it works some influence on the present. If One Night in a Bad Inn and my other books had only been about people behaving badly, about self-inflicted pointless misery, I would not have written it. It is the example of my grandmother, Ayala, Grandma T, the pretty lady on the cover, that made it a worthy endeavor. Had I watered down the bad acts of her parents and her brothers and the footloose nature of her husband, I would have undercut her strength of character, and that wouldn't have been fair. It would not have been a service to the truth. And I think all writing really should be a service to the truth. I was not going to live like that, she said. I was going to be a lady, and that she was. And in telling her story, my hope is that her example will work some positive influence on the present. Thank you for your attention. I have the handouts up here, brochures. All these books are for sale, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.